And this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And we still have some orchids that Flourish has that are waiting for a home that would take a year for the new sprout to sprout, but they're quite healthy orchids, and a few other plants that don't always find joy in a florist shop. They need a little bit of tender, loving care. So if you have interest in that, give me a call, 351-1911, and I'll run around the corner and check it out. We had 2 or 3 answers last week, and Denise might actually take a few plants. But it's nice to see that people just don't throw out their poinsettias at the end of the season. It's nice to see that the plants are there for more than just one day, or 1 week. I wanted to report on a newspaper article, our rail trail that Monticello has put in. The city of Monticello has put in a mile of rail trail that goes from their western edge to County Farm Road, and then that's being extended by another best part of a mile around to the western side of Monticello, where there are a bunch of subdevelopments that are doing quite well, and the library is being placed there. There's also a 30-acre ballpark being developed, and some of Monticello's action will go over to the western side of the river and be adjacent to Old 47, which is the highway that used to go to Decatur. And that has been replaced by Interstate 72, which takes most of the traffic. We're seriously hoping that corridor might be reopened as a shared trail. Shared trails are trails where there are loud and clear annotations, i.e. a picture of a bicycle on the road. It's shared, and that is sort of suggesting that the traffic be fairly careful and reasonably slow. Since it's an unused road to a large extent, people can travel it at a very high speed. So we're thinking Monticello, Armenia, Cisco, Argenter, Oriana, into Decatur, and that needs some thought. It needs some thought amongst the community, because it's felt that this would be a dangerous road. I think we have to get to the point where we can, as motorists, recognize a bicycle or even a motorcycle, and at various cities here, whether it's Champaign, Danville, or Decatur, they are developing in-city bicycle ways, but now we need to concentrate some on the connectors, and that is one of them. Old Route 47 between Monticello and Decatur. Since it's been a highway, it has one place where there was a rest stop, so it could be the same. And it has on either side the usual prairie that is often taken over on the farm side, but between the railroad and the highway is quite a lot of prairie plants and prairie soil that hasn't been disturbed. There's also a cemetery or two which tells you about the history. And we had a meeting on Saturday with a group that is the Champaign, Havana, and White Heath Railroad. And we had a board meeting there, and we were discussing some of these things. And I was especially interested in young people getting to enjoy stories that are around these sorts of places. You can. Do we know the history of Argenta? Why was it called Argenta? How does it relate to the Sangamon River, which is nearby? What about the railroad? Was Argenta a railroad name? Was Argenta a person on the railroad board? So we're interested, and I was particularly interested to see that Mary Hayes, who has been writing stories for the News Gazette and for the Republican in Monticello, about the little things that happen around about. What about the sky? What about the coolness? She's gone off to do a master's degree in Kentucky, and she's encountering people who haven't encountered the same sort of cold weather as she is. So what she thinks is reasonably warm, they think is absolutely atrociously cold. They get all covered up, and they don't have probably the equipment to remove snow if it happens and things like that. So I'm encouraging people who write sophisticated documents to write the same thing for younger people who may not be able to quite understand the complexity of 10 examples. Give them one example, 2 examples. Simplify the language. Allow them to become part of the storytelling. And that sort of language may not be purchased by adults. It's actually purchased by interested young folk. And they're there. And they're the next generation that we would like to encourage. So there are my 2 comments to start with. We'll continue last week's effort with railroad demolition, just to let you know what we were talking about. We were talking about the Peoria and Eastern Railroad, and that was between Danville and Peoria and Pekin, those places to the west, and a portion of it has eventually become 25 miles of Kickapoo Trail. And but 18 years ago, that corridor was being demolished. We discussed, and we've discussed this many times, the Rail Banking Act and the fact that if you're working with the federal government, you could have a interim trail use of this corridor. That meant it could go back to rail, but you might have it for months and years, not necessarily months, but you'd have it for years. And the railroad would not buy the bed, but they would give you money to develop it, and they would quiet the titles and keep the bridges, which are usually mandated out just in case you caused a liability problem by falling off the bridge. And one of our bridges is 160 feet off the ground, so you would die if you fell off it. So knowing that, we were looking at taking out the last tracks. The last tracks were taken out by a train which was going to load stick rail, and they took 1/4 mile at a time, and that rail was pulled onto the train by a sort of ringer or winch that would bring it onto 20 or so flat cars with racks for the rail to be on. That meant that the rail to start with had to be fairly easy to get hold of, so that a lot of the spikes and were removed, so that when you lifted up the rail, you could lift up the spikes and then drop off the plates and ties that might lift up with it. But gradually it could be rolled onto the train in a pure line of stick rail held together by bolts and joiners. That rail would go off to some organization, I think in this case in New York, where the bolt holes for those joiners were cut off and the rails were welded, and they'd come back to an active railroad as old rail or rail that's totally connected. That reduces the damage that occurs when a heavy load pushes down one join and hits on the other side of the join and causes breakage and derailment. So we start at Dobbins Drive. The train stops about the end of Main Street and then winds on the first quarter mile and then moves on to the next one. The engine moving carefully because you've taken out quite a few of the spikes, and you keep going. That leaves the bed without rail, but it leaves it with ties and plates and spikes. So a team of people, contractors, and in this case mostly Mexican contractors, pick up the spikes and pick up the plates and put them to the side, and they're picked up by a truck. By this time, a truck can move along the corridor. Once the plates and spikes have been taken out, a snowplow-like organization goes through and shifts the ties onto either side. And then another truck, which is called a knuckle boom, has a crane on the back, and the person sits on the back and can pick up 3, 4, 5 ties at a time. The ties have already been labeled, good, bad, and indifferent. There are landscapers. There are very good relay ties. We discussed a little bit the way that ties were made. In the past, they were made with an adze and an axe, and because the grain, the person who was making the tie could adjust the grain, these were ties that didn't weather very easily, and so some of them are probably been around since 1850s. They're often got a curl in them because the grain is not exactly straight. So the modern tie is sawn, and it doesn't obey the strict grain and is a little more vulnerable. Both ties were heavily ingested with creosote. So these are not the sort of ties you would like to burn in your chip heater or in your backyard barbecue because they would be poisonous. But over the years, if they've been sitting for 100 years, some of that has leached into the soils, and we worry about that a little bit. But the ties are picked up and put into bundles of 9 ties, and then contractors come and take those off to places like Menards that sell them for landscaping, or they take up the A-grade ties and they go to relay in other places. The corridor moves through towns, and those towns tend to be the places where the steel is accumulated. So you have piles of plates and eventually the ties are stacked up and resold. There are ones that cannot be resold because they're old and decrepit, and they're hard to get rid of because they have creosote in them, and the law says that they should either be buried very deep in the soil or they should be burned at a temperature of like 350 degrees to break down the phenolic compounds that are in creosote. So you can't just send your leftover ties to the landfill. You have to deal with them properly. That train progressed through the towns that you should know about. So we go from Urbana to Fultz to St. Joe to I forget the name of the no, the one that is at where the Union Pacific is I always forget his name. But anyway, it's a little village. And then on to Ogden, and then there's a little town called Rumpler, which is almost non-existent now, and then to an elevator, and then to Fithian, where we had a lot to do with preserving the early interurban depot there, and somebody's bought it, and they've done a very good job of preserving it. Then to Muncie, then to Oakwood, then to Bronson. It's before Oakwood, I think, and then after that there's a little burg before you come to the Salt Fork of the Vermilion River. I have these maps, so I can tell you. Ogden. The one that people don't recognize most is Rumpler. It has a square elevator there, and square elevators aren't awfully strong because the strength comes from having a circular elevator. So when you get to Oakwood, the road starts to be a little wiggly-woggly because there was strip mining there on the Vermilion, and there were little railroad lines everywhere. There was some deep mining, and there was strip mining. And you can go to Mission Field and look over the strip mining. And there's still mining in the area. A lot of the miners came from Kentucky, that sort of area. And so Danville and other communities around have the element of pit props and ponies to pull rail cars of coal out, and those pit props had to be generated. There was an era when there were enough trees to generate 2,000 ties a mile, and then to prop up the roof of the seam of coal. There's three ways of doing it. One is to put wooden props and take all the coal out, or otherwise you leave a stand of coal which becomes a pillar or a prop. And most of the deep mining in Danville, I think, is using pillars of coal to hold up the roof. You just hope the roof doesn't fall in. In some places, after many years, the roof does fall in, and your landscape goes down by perhaps 3, 4, 5, 10 feet. And that happens in southern Illinois in places. So that's part of the problem of having mines, is that it's not that simple. And then those people who were providing the ponies and the food for ponies and had little 5-acre lots, when you went to strip mining, you lost that sort of industry. So a lot of people in the Danville area have 5-acre lots with 2 or 3 dead cows and a different industry, and that's why Danville is somewhat of an industrial town, because those sorts of people could be very effective as industrial people. It means a change in lifestyle, but it's there. So knowing that little bit of history, you know about the East Peoria and Eastern Railroad, which went through Champaign to Bloomington to Peoria. Okay, well, that corridor is now bought by the Forest Preserve and the Vermilion County Conservation District, and it's being developed as a trail. It also has area on either side. There's 100 feet wide, and the area that's not the ballast where the train used to run becomes prairie preservation site. So what I wanted to remind you about today is perhaps to go from the demolition thing, perhaps should add that there are sorts of artifacts along the railroad bed before we get to the biology. Like where there's a crossover, there are cross arms, and those cross arms had a steel stanchion and a pedestal, and it had an era flavor. We tried very hard to preserve those crossover signs because they give people an understanding of what railroad was about in the 1850s. It's unfortunate that those signs, the actual sign, railroad crossing, is often aluminum, so there's a salvage value to these signs as well as a historic sign. The trail doesn't go right into Danville. It goes to the state park, which is the Kickapoo State Park, and that's a logical endpoint. But in the long run, you would hope that this rail bed goes into Danville. It goes through Hillary and into Danville proper, and then perhaps on to Indianapolis. The quid pro quo for the railroads is that it's an interim trail, and it can be taken over by railroading in the future. That's not likely to happen quickly, and if it does happen, the railroad has to buy the line back and compensate the trail people for money that's been put into a trail that won't be used anymore. But it's likely that this trail will be around for 50, 100 years, unless there's some political move to have more industry in one of these places like Danville or Champaign. And the line is active between Urbana and Bloomington, and it's active to Mansfield. It's not active through Farmer City because there's a bridge out there, but there's something like a 30-mile unit of this rail bed that's intact. It's not abandoned in the sense of taking up the tracks. It's there, and this could come back. So you could think about a connection between Bloomington and Indianapolis. But not everyone likes to hear about that because the recreators are wanting to have a trail, and it's very popular. There's like 1,500 of these trails that the Rail Banking Act inspired, and they're very popular. And one of the problems for the railroad is that when they want to come back into some of these things, there's a lot of criticism. So coming back now to what do you do with the prairie? The prairie is not the greatest prairie. It's the only prairie in many cases. So you want to augment it. Unfortunately, when we didn't get enough money to buy that bed back, CSX bought it, the railroad company, and it sold an easement of 25 feet to the adjacent road. The railroads were first. The roads followed the railroads in many cases, and the towns were established on the railroad bed the roads logically followed that pattern. If you want to widen, it's very hard to widen out of one side like into the farms. So it's very tempting to widen out of the railroad bed, which is the only prairie soil or prairie remnant plants. And creatures, too. We don't encounter the creatures quite so much, but the plant habitat provides the home for many creatures. It's kind of nice to find a meadow vole or a snake or thousands and thousands and millions of bacteria and fungi operating in this sort of relatively undisturbed soil. Now, so we have a 5 miles by 25 feet at least easement for widening of the road. The road is only being widened by 2 feet on either side. A little bit has been taken out of the farmland, sort of equal on either side. But we've lost a lot of the prairie. That when we go back to the photographs we took 20 years ago, this was prairie, and it's unfortunately the trees, the invasive trees, have taken over in that period. So it looks like a forest, and people who travel these trails often think about forest. They like a tree. They can hug a tree. They can sit under a tree and have a sandwich, and they don't like to see trees going up. But under each tree there is a population of seed and prairie plants that will come back. So we're hoping that the trees will gradually be removed, and then we'll go back to prairie so that people in Illinois can understand what their ecosystem was. We're down to 0.001%, very, very little left, and we need that not only just for your ambience to know what a prairie is, but to preserve the biochemicals and the like that we might not know we're going to use in 500 years' time. What I want to talk about is that 25 feet. Well, the 25 feet, the first thing that happened was it was designated. A plastic fence was put up at about the 25-foot level, and that was mainly to indicate where the end of the 25 feet was. And so the contractors have subcontracted. All the trees that were on that corridor are now removed. And some of them were big. Some of them were probably in existence when the railroad was there. So that they may be 50 years old. Some of them are quite big. If you count the number of rings on a tree, you can get an idea of the age. And so those trees were sawn down and chopped up and mulched. The mulch is fairly big. The mulch goes off to places where mulch can be used. You can't use, as a gardener, you can't use too much mulch, because if you do, you have to have a bacteria and other organisms to break down that mulch, and that kind of destroys takes energy out of the soil. So tend to use mulch fairly simply and in a limited fashion. So interesting machinery was used. There's a machine that gobbled up logs that would be 6 or 8 inches across, and that it would be chipped by a motor that was like 1,000 horsepower, and those chips were then blown into a semi-trailer that was backed up to this instrument. So that 5 miles between Urbana and St. Joe, which is the only widening at the moment, is being cleared for the 25 feet. So there's a chance to put back a prairie on that corridor. Since we're dealing with a Kickapoo Trail, and since we have very little prairie left, we're hoping that the planting of that corridor would be designed to create a prairie habitat for that 5 miles between Havana and St. Joe. In order to do that, we have to think about how you would seed it. The best way for most prairie people is if the land can be kept fairly intact, then that would be helpful. If you could sit on the side of the road and you're going to move the roadside ditch closer to the railroad trail, you're going to move the ditch across. So you could, in some places especially, you could sit there with a hi-ho and make the ditch without necessarily removing it. That's kind of a expensive way to do it, but it would preserve the prairie. It's not likely to happen in most cases. It's easier to go through the existing ditch and through the 25-foot easement and take the prairie soil and remold it. That means that you cut out the remnant prairie, and it's in the middle of summer, so the remnant prairie has a very great hard time regenerating after that. And besides, the prairie soil is mounded up on the side of the widening, so that it's a spot where the Department of Transportation likes to mow. So there are some species mixes here that go in, and usually the one that's on the side of the road, you have a ditch that goes down to the gusset of the ditch and then up toward the prairie and the railroad bed. So the cross section from the middle of the road is road edge, about 2 feet of gravel and whatnot, and that side is now largely prairie soil. It's very good soil. It usually is planted to things like ryegrass and bromgrass and a little bit of switchgrass that we're not too sure about, and that is an area that can be mown down to the ditch. Usually it has been traditional to mow down to the ditch and then in the fall to mow up the side of the ditch. We would like to see that the Forest Preserve, which now owns the Kickapoo Trail, would get to manage that prairie that's on the roadside. It's not a simple process of putting in bromgrass and whatnot. It's a matter of trying to work with the roadside people so that the down ditch is mainly grasses that can be mown. And sometimes it's very, very heavily planted to switchgrass, which is able to stay in dap over winter and is ostensibly very good for the wildlife, but is very aggressive, and it is a fire hazard if you have someone who runs a cigarette into it, or if you're doing controlled burns. So at this time of the year, this is why I'm doing this program now, is to alert you to thinking about how you would plant this prairie. First of all, you have to have seed. And if you're doing the roadside piece, then you're interested in instant gratification. You would like this roadside to grow plants in 10 days. And it looks good, and then it gets mown, and that gives jobs to people, and it also makes people who like neatness to feel that the situation is controlled. Being evil-minded, we prairie people would like to sprinkle some of that roadside with side oats or little blue stem or grasses that would take some mowing. And we would beg for a low mow procedure so that it was lightly mown and it was not mown by a 15-foot bush hog, but with a smaller tractor that could control just that area that is on the roadside edge. We sometimes call it the batter. And the roadside edge could be manicured in the traditional manner that would satisfy everyone who feels that a roadside should be neat and tidy and not filled with crappy-looking prairie. But we would like to see the prairie there. So down the slope is usually mown if we have good arrangements with the Department of Transportation, and then that's quite possible. They themselves will plant mainly grasses, not too much big blue stem and Indian grass, which is tall, 8 feet tall, but more with the little short like little blue stem and bootaloo, side oats, and and you perhaps can include a few broadleaves, but it's also an area that is mostly heavily mown. Since it's going to be good prairie soil, we would like to, in this case, have a heritage corridor and have that downslope planted to some prairie. Then you go, and the gusset. The gusset is the piece that's in the ditch. It's like if you have a shopping bag, it is 6 inches wide. The piece that goes underneath where you put your food is called a gusset, and that gusset may be a foot wide. And then you go up toward the railroad, the trail, and that's where we would have a different mix again. That's where we would start to put in prairie plants that were similar to the ones that were eliminated. You have to know that this was of concern to a lot of groups, from the Forest Preserve to the Illinois nature people, the Committee on Natural Areas out of the university, the Grand Prairie Friends, a whole bunch of people who knew that corridor, even in some places where there are no trees because they haven't just grown, they were able to salvage. So those salvage plants have gone to other places, and 50 truckloads of soil have gone to the Homer Lake, where they will generate prairie out of the soil that's there and the gene pool of seed that's in the prairie. So there's been salvage that's gone on. But left in that upside embankment is quite a bit of seed. And so you have to think about where the seed is coming from, who plants what and where. There's a statute for the seeding of roadsides, and there's a book, and you go to the book, and there's a number 1 prairie planting, and there's a number 2 and number 3, and there's also some negotiation. So we're talking about the roadside, the down ditch, the gusset, the up ditch, and at this time, those seed mixes are being put together. So we have some questions about who is doing what with where and who checks up on what statute. So if you are given the opportunity to plant a prairie mix, then what is in the prairie mix and who's providing the seed? We've talked on the air about low bid seed, but there's so little prairie left in Illinois that you mostly have to hand harvest it. You can have a small harvester. We can do it with a combine harvester that's adapted. But most of the prairie that remains is on the west side of the Mississippi, and that's where you can have cattle, and there's the places like the Ozarks have a terrain that has a range of prairie species, and they're not necessarily the same as what we had in Illinois. So at this time of the year, when the prairie mixes are being put together, do we know who the contractor is and who the subcontractor is? So we find the seed company that's providing the seed, and the seed company has subcontractors. So the ryegrass might come from New Jersey, and the other seeds might come from Oregon, and it's very definitely not Illinois seed. When it comes to prairie seed, if you're not careful, what you have is a low-bid seed from Kansas or somewhere out there, which is different. It may not necessarily be a different species, but it's a different variety or different gene pool. And what you pick in Kansas may be sterile in Illinois. It may take years. If you take seed of big blue stem from from southern Illinois, and you put that at Goose Lake Prairie, it's a different cat, and it takes a while for it to adapt and to come back to being fertile in the new location. So the same sort of thing can happen on this corridor to St. Joe. So do we know the subcontractors, the contractors for seed that comes for the roadside? And that's the first question. And at this time, if we want to suggest that it not include a lot of switchgrass, for instance, we want to suggest that it doesn't have any sweet clover. Sweet clover is a legume, and it's often felt that this is a fertilizer. We never use fertilizer in a prairie restoration because it creates a fertility that encourages cultivars and cultivar weeds. So no fertilizer. And we don't really appreciate the inclusion of legumes like sweet clover that are tremendously aggressive and can totally destroy your prairie. So is our mix going to have switchgrass? What variety of switchgrass and what amount of switchgrass? It has a very small seed, so if you put 10 ounces of switchgrass in against 10 ounces of big blue stem, then there's going to be a lot more switchgrass. So yeah, if we're careful, we get the seed to be made into a mix by the number of seeds that are coming, not by the ounces of seed. So you know, people like the Prairie Moon know how many seeds per ounce. So you can use the term ounce, but you know that if you're going to plant switchgrass, you plant a low number of ounces because you have a rough idea of how many seeds there are in an ounce. The sweet clover seems to have a tradition of people who seem to think that it really is important to have a natural fertilizer that can take in nitrogen and use rhizobacteria to convert that nitrogen into a form of nitrogen that when the plant breaks down, it provides a fertilizer. But wow, we've had this happen on Route 10. If you are not there 10 years beforehand to make sure that there's no sweet clover, then sweet clover is planted and it can destroy the native prairie. Wow. So we're getting along here. I'm trying to figure out how to continue this. So we need to check with seed people at the moment. The and especially if you get some sort of sympathy from the Department of Transportation, knowing that you're interested in a heritage corridor, then any adaptation that should be made now. And any rules of the game. The next thing is planting, and the rules of the game are there. Traditionally, if you plant a pasture or a grass, you tickle the soil with a cultivator, and we tend to not want to do that because the prairie is used to hard soils that have been rained on and hardened by rain for centuries, and they've had buffalo walking across them and things like that. So prairie is used to low fertilizer, low rainfall, and it can deal with that situation. If we plant the seed, there's a timing situation here. If we plant the seed in the fall, then the prairie plants are going to have to really work to do to compete with the weed seeds, especially if there's fertilizer. Fertilizer and moisture is good rainfall in the spring. So we tend to plant the prairie seed in June when it starts to be a drought. By that time, the weeds have grown and they've seeded or start to seed. You catch them before they seed and mow them and then plant your prairie. The prairie will grow very slowly. Sometimes it puts down roots first and you don't even know it's growing. You can be there 5 years and you can only see weed, and it's very disappointing to anyone who thinks they're going to grow a prairie instantly. It's not there. So timing is essential, and rainfall is essential. So you plant where you have an advantage for a prairie. That means that you have to know the contractor and the rules that the contractor is working on. That means you have to work with the Department of Transportation to know whether they're going to tickle the soil, fertilize the soil, and then plant it. And how do you plant it? Do you plant it with a range drill that makes a little corridor, has a nice little tamping wheel and tamps it down and creates a place for the prairie plants? Or is it going to be hydroseeded, where you mix the seed with a mulch and spew it over the ground? That's much cheaper to do than to do the range drill thing. And the range drill is a special drill that has a cog that pushes the seed down, because often prairie seed is fluffy and different in its physiology. It's got little umbrellas on it and whatnot, and you need a very wide dropper, like 2 inches wide, so it will drop into the soil and then be planted. So who are the contractors and how do we work with the contractors? And can local people have any contact with those contractors? That is a problem that needs to be worked on now, because it's a temptation to look at the soil that is bare, that is eroded, and put an instant gratification to it by planting seed. And that is not an easy thing to debate. So as you go along to St. Joe, or if you just take a bicycle tour out there, think about how you would plant this prairie. I'm suggesting that you can dipsy-doodle seed into it in the winter, and it can grow a root or two before the weed seeds get into action. So that's something you can do with extra seed. You can do it for another 15 years after the road's gone through. But there's a logic to planting the seed in the summer. And so how do we get to the contractors to ask that question, or to the IDOT to ask that question? once the seed is planted, it's going to be a weed field for up to 10 years. That's quite typical. You can get some growth for 5 years, and it looks a little bit like a prairie. You can tidy that up by transplanting into it and dipsy-doodling into certain seeds are good progenitors. Liatris and some prairie plants are quite willing to grow in rough, tough situations. But you've got to watch that you don't get a mix so you have a Liatris prairie. You're wanting a more diverse spectrum of seed, and that comes slowly. Figure that it took 10,000 years after glaciation for this prairie to get into action, and you're trying to simulate it very quickly. So dipsy-doodling seed collected locally is very helpful, so we want volunteers that do that. And the seed, if you plant it in the snow, the seed is often black and in brown, and if you have a nice friendly sunshine, it melts, it heats up that little black seed and it drops into the snow and then right into the soil, and it has some advantages. So Grand Prairie Friends has had quite a deal of success about dipsy-doodling seed into prairie areas that are around restoration sites, buffer zones around restoration sites. And so dipsy-doodling seed in the fall is okay. Planting in the spring is not so okay because it's nice and wet for weed seeds, and it's warm, and especially if you have any thought of fertilizer. If we get given by grant money fertilizer, we try to find somebody who can use the fertilizer. We don't use that. Planting in the May-June time is good. It looks dry. You've got to be careful because this area has a drought in the summertime, and if you go too far into the drought season, the seed will shrivel up and go dormant till the next year. So then you have to ask, does this contract have enough money to take a 1,000-gallon water tank along the roadside and water the prairie so that the seed doesn't go dormant? So a lot of this depends on the local scene and how the rainfall is coming. And now we have climate change. It's not so easy to predict what's happening during the summer. So if you go into May, June, and there's enough rain to germinate, then it gets dry, then water the stuff. There's one other thing that is very helpful, we think, and there's a lot of different opinions as to how they plant prairie, but especially if the area has been tickled with a cultivator to loosen up the soil, which is sort of a traditional agronomic way of doing things, you can roll the soil. Roll the soil, make it hard, more like what the rain-hardened soil and the buffalo-hardened soil was like years ago. And that means contracts that include rolling the soil, not with a heavy-duty roller, but with a light rolling to create a better field. Just think about those things as you volunteer to help the prairie people, and especially the Forest Preserve, which is doing an excellent job of trying to deal with all these situations that are right by your front door. And we will probably repeat this because it's hard for people to realize all the variables that you have in this situation. Well, it's time for us to part.
Maybe you could tell folks some of the places that they can most easily get to Prairie, where they can actually go down to Meadowbrook Park. Would you recommend that as a good Prairie, or other places?
Meadowbrook Park is good. Lake Park is good. They're the two closest ones locally.
And folks, I know Lake Park because we've actually gone out there, but it's kind of, people probably don't even know that it's there. It's right near one of the housing
It's behind
divisions.
Winfield Village. It is owned by Lake Park Housing Group. There's 75 houses there. There's a cutoff meander which makes the lake, and the cutoff goes past soils that were used for cornfields, and we managed to get involved there because the cutoff banks of the cutoff are at a 45-degree angle, and the regular cultivar bankside creatures don't grow very well, but prairie has deep roots and it can grow. And gradually we got 3 acres of prairie there, and it's very nice. It's artificial. It's on a cornfield. It's near to a lot of housing, and but it's only a few miles from Champaign. And likewise, Meadowbrook Park is a good site too.
So if people want to go, Winfield Village is down in Savoy, is that right?
Yes.
So if you go down to Savoy,
you can access the Lake Park from First Street. It's just past Curtis Road. If you go into the west side through Winfield Village, and Winfield Village uses this corridor a lot. People walk around, don't always know that what it's prairie. But there are stewards there, one of them is Marcy Ridgway, who lives nearby and does a lot of getting rid of the invasive weeds like sweet clover. And it's an excellent prairie and available. If you're going to the airport and you want to show someone what your local ecosystem is, then you can do that there. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.